Great. It is 4:04 p.m. tonight on May 19th. We're convening for a special Board of Directors meeting. Can I ask the district secretary? Oh, actually, first let me ask, does the general manager have any housekeeping items that he'd like to cover?
Sure, I'll just cover this briefly. Good afternoon. On behalf of the ACWD Board, I'd like to welcome everyone's participation in this special meeting of the ACWD Board of Directors. My name is Robert Shaver. I serve as the district's general manager. Members of the public may participate in this special board meeting by either using the Zoom app or by telephone. This evening's workshop will focus primarily on two topics, and each topic will feature a presentation by ACWD staff. There will be pauses at either the end of each staff presentation or logical intervals for members of the public to ask questions or to engage with the board. If you're participating by Zoom, generally we ask that all participants mute their mics unless speaking. You also may be placed on mute by the district secretary. And in Zoom, you'll be able to view the presentation materials as they are presented to the board. If you're participating by telephone, you may download the slides from the district's website at www.acwd.org. And please put your phone on mute to assure the best sound quality for everyone. And you will be prompted at the appropriate time when you may make public comments. The Zoom webinar will be recorded and is going to be made available to the public for future viewing. Thank you for attending. That's it, President Akbari.
Thank you, Mr. Shaver. Can I ask the district secretary to take roll call, please?
Yes, Directors Weed.
Here.
Gunther.
Here.
Huang.
Here.
Sethi. And Akbari.
Here. With that, Director Huang, would you like to lead us in the salute to the flag, please?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Director Huang. Okay, moving on to item 3, public comments on matters on this notice of special meeting. Do we have any members of the public who wish to make a comment? Hearing none and seeing no hands raised in the Zoom app, we can close the public comment section and move on to item 4.1, fiscal year 2019-2020 financial benchmarking report. The district conducts an annual financial benchmark analysis that compares its performance against the performance of other similar Bay Area water providers. The analysis is based on audited data from the prior year and considers a number of metrics pertaining to operational efficiency, financial capacity, and the financial impact to customers. And with that, I will turn it over to our general manager, Mr. Shaver.
Thank you, President Akbari. As you mentioned, each year our finance manager provides a benchmarking analysis for the board, and Mr. Wunderlich is prepared to do that.
Great, thank you, Mr. Shaver. Hopefully everybody can now see my screen with the presentation. Not a whole lot has changed from last year, and so I do plan to move through this presentation relatively quickly, but of course I'm happy to stop and discuss at any point at the pleasure of the board or public. And so again, the purpose here is to really explain how we're doing compared to other similar water providers. And so I'll go through an overview of what's included in the metrics, then we'll actually get to the metrics themselves, and then kind of have the so what at the end, so what does all of this mean? And so the data was taken from audited financial reports for each of the comparator agencies, which are similar Bay Area water suppliers, including East Bay Mud, San Francisco PUC, Dublin San Ramon Services District, Marin Municipal, Contra Costa, and then San Jose Water Company. We do not distribute surveys. This is data pulled from the audited financial statements. The metrics fall into these general categories of operational efficiency. So cost of water, connections per employee, operating revenue per employee, operating cost per employee. If you participated in the operational review session at the recent Aqua conference, some of these metrics will sound pretty familiar from that conference session. We also look at some financial capacity metrics, mostly pertaining to the debt burden of the district compared to its revenues. And then the rate impact. So what does all that mean to the customer? What does the customer pay in a typical bill, and what sort of rate increases have customers been experiencing? This is one where there is an update. The cost of water, we've changed that to dollars per HCF or 100 cubic feet, which is our standard billing unit. I see we have Mr. Nishimura on the meeting this year. That was a comment he made last year asking for this change because he felt it would be more accessible to the public. And so we've gone ahead and made that change. I've kind of explained what some of the other metrics are, but just quickly, liabilities divided by operating revenue. That gives a good picture of the overall financial capacity and flexibility to address financial challenges. And I'll say with each year that we do this analysis, this is the metric that increasingly I seem to find myself finding the most relevant and valuable. Because it gives a great picture of an agency's overall debt burden, whether that's bonded debt for capital projects or your pension and retiree healthcare debt. And it just gives you the sense of the overall debt burden compared to revenues. So meaning your ability to handle that debt. And what we've seen, especially during the pandemic, is a lot of agencies have tried to consider what they can do with their rates to recognize the economic impact to many of their customers. Is that the agencies that are really driven by their debt burden have not had the flexibility to forego or reduce planned rate increases because they're really driven, again, by that debt obligation.
If I just quick note on the cost of water, we calculate that using different components every time. It seems like every time I look at it. So I'd be interested sometime to get a more detailed breakdown and hopefully a standardization of what we view as the cost of water.
Yeah, so for purposes of this benchmarking, we look at the total cash payments during the fiscal year divided by the actual amount of water produced. For example, if you're an agency with a high fixed cost or a low fixed cost, you could see some differences here in this benchmark. But the reason we do it this way with the cash payments is that we have a number of different agencies that we're comparing against, and we all have different revenue sources. Some agencies may have more property tax than others. Some agencies may rely more on development fees than others. And so we felt that this is a good way to try to equalize that by focusing on how much the agencies spend.
Okay, when you said, but again, cash payments for what? Is it water, power, and chemicals?
No, total cash payments, total costs for everything. Cash payments for everything spent by an agency.
That could include some bond payments?
Yes, absolutely.
So it's not just it's not the commodity, it's not the variable cost necessarily.
No.
There's some fixed elements involved in this definition of the cost of water.
Absolutely. This is the total cost of providing water service. Yep.
My suggestion is on the title, cost of water service, as opposed, some people might think it's the actual cost of the water that we're purchasing. So help clarify. Thank you.
All right. Yes, we will make that adjustment for next year. All right, so we'll get into some of the metric comparisons. First one, cost of water service. ACWD on each of these charts will be the blue bar on the far left with the horizontal blue bar representing the median. And so on this one, we are just a little below the median. What always strikes me on this one is how close together so many agencies are. Next, connections per employee. Again, in this case, being above the blue bar is a good thing. We have more connections per employee than the median agency. Operating revenue per employee, again, this is where above the blue bar would be considered more efficient operations. And it is hard to see because it's very close, but the agency in the orange bar is the median, and we are just a hair above the median on this metric comparison. And then operating cost per connection, again, this is one where you want to be below the median, and we are below the median here. This is one just to give an example where if you're an agency that has more industrial customers, for example, it would be more challenging to rate well in this kind of metric. But since, so that is, one consideration with this, we are below the median, which is a good thing. But in part that also reflects our heavily residential service area. Debt coverage ratio, we continue to have by far the highest debt coverage ratio of any of the comparable agencies. You see most are hovering near the 2.0. But because we fund our capital program largely on a pay-go basis, our debt coverage is very high. This is the one metric where we are on the kind of the wrong side of the median line, so to say. So we do have greater pension and OPEB total liability than the median agency by a little bit. I'll get to some more details on this in some of the kind of conclusion slides. But then once you factor in bonded debt, because we have so little bonded debt, our total liabilities divided by operating revenue continues to be well below the median. So our total debt, our total long-term liabilities is just a little bit more than our annual operating revenue. And then last year, our monthly bill was a little higher than median. This year, we are the median agency, and that's really a result of consistently having smaller rate increases than the median agency. As reflected in this slide, the median rate increase of these compared agencies in the 1920 fiscal year was a little over 7%, whereas our increase was 4%. And then because we did not implement a rate increase during the current fiscal year, when I come back at next year's budget workshop, we will see, some additional progress on some of these metrics. And so to get to some of the variances from what was presented last year on the cost of water service, we did improve from median to one below the median. And then as I referenced on the pension and OPEB liabilities, our ratio last year was 3.15 and it reduced to 2.67. So we did make really strong progress on that over the course of that fiscal year as a result of CalPERS returns, as well as our advanced funding contributions that we've made. But what we saw is that the agency that was at the median last year also made significant gains. So relative to median, we did not really change too much, but we did make significant improvement in terms of our overall long-term debt for these obligations.
Is this funded total liability or unfunded liability?
Oh, this would be unfunded liability.
Again, I encourage you to insert the word unfunded liability in the chart.
All right, so then, as mentioned, we improved to the median agency, and our rate increase in 1819 was 3.4% less than the median, and in 1920 our rate increase was 2.5% below the median. So again, consistently maintaining rate increases that are less than median, which in my view is primarily a result of that our cumulative debts are relatively small compared to our operating revenue. And then in conclusion, again, I would not really focus on comparisons against individual agencies. There are a lot of unique factors. For example, we have a mix of managing our own water supplies and purchasing water from other wholesale providers. Some of the agencies we compare against, they do 100% purchases from a wholesale agency. Others fully manage their own supplies, right? And so you're going to find different profiles for different types of metrics based on those approaches to meeting your water supply needs. But while I wouldn't compare against specific agencies, I do think looking at the median is a good barometer of how we're doing overall. And as we saw as we walk through this, we do compare favorably in all three of the broad categories of efficiency, financial capacity, and our overall rate impact. And so this is something that we will continue to update each year and present to the board. With that, I would be happy to answer any questions.
Make a
Thank
quick
you, Mr.
note.
Wunderlich.
No, please. Yes.
No, go ahead, Director Reed.
No, I would note in Roland Bosca that the Bosca is responsible for members are responsible for about 1/3 of the pension and OPEB liabilities of the SFPUC water enterprise. And it's worth keeping tabs of what's going on there. I will be getting a report later this year. Our share of that will be about 6%. Their unfunded liability is $163 million, which means the OPEB members are liable for about 55 million. We have 6% of the 55, so we're over $3 million in unfunded our share of the San Francisco PUC liability as one that's been lost in the process because they're not funding it. They're running it up and it's growing at quite a rate. So it's something to keep an eye on. One of our economic parameters, and it shows up with one of our comparable agencies, and a totally different approach to the philosophy that they have toward OPEB than do the other districts. They're finally being required by GASB to start reporting it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Director Weed. I also believe I see Director Sethi here. So just want to reflect that for our minutes.
Yes, I joined at 4:22 here. I apologize for being late. I was across the bay and I just came back. I was a little delayed. Sorry about it, folks. But I have read all the pre-reading materials, so I'm familiar with what's being discussed. Sorry about it again.
Not a problem. Thank you, Director Sethi. Let me see if there are any other directors who wish to ask a question or make a comment.
I'd like to just make a comment, I guess. Director Weed's comment recent there about the Bosca, I am particularly interested in Director Weed's statement and certainly feel that he will keep an eye on this and keep us informed. So thank you, John. I think hold a concern as to you. Thanks.
Let me make one other note on our financial situation. We're doing quite well. Our bottom line, our net value is increasing by about, for the last several years, has increased over $4 million per month, every month. So we've got, in 3 years, we've put another $150 million that we have available for capital investments and other paying off of other debts and obligations. So some of that will be needed for our capital improvement program, but overall, we have a very profitable business at present. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. I see we have a hand from a member of the public. Mr. Ken Nishimura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, President Akbari. I really enjoy, first of all, thank you, Mr. Wunderlich, for changing the units of reporting to the 100 cubic feet or per unit. That eliminates one set of arithmetic required. I'm kind of curious, you reported that the integrated cost of water, so you said this is the total cash outlay of the district for this fiscal year divided by the amount of water produced. It turned out to be, I'm just sort of guessing, it's about $6.60 per unit. Based on your average household of 8 units per month, that works out to be about $53 of the cost of the water, or the cost of producing that water and having it delivered. Yet the average monthly bill is about $65, which what that, and I assume that the discrepancy there for the average household is due to the fixed cost. The variable cost or the consumption charge that the residents pay is about $4.60 a unit. The average, or your production cost, or your cost, total cost is $6.60, but there's on top of that the $50+ fixed charge that's on the bi-monthly bill. So the conclusion that I get from this is that the average household, which uses 8 units per month, is subsidizing the larger consumers that use more water, because for those people, or for those customers, the fixed charge becomes a smaller fraction of their bill. Is that a correct assumption, conclusion, Mr. Wunderlich?
So I guess a couple of thoughts in response to that. First, I wouldn't use the word subsidizing, because a significant amount of our costs are fixed, no matter how much water needs to be produced. And so, kind of from that perspective, what's the appropriate way to allocate those fixed costs, and how should customers share in them? And so I think when you consider it from that perspective, you can't necessarily say that the appropriate amount a person should pay is only based on the per unit cost, right? So like if a customer used only 2 units of water, I don't think we would say that they were covering the full cost for us to operate the system for their 2 units if they paid, $13.20 on that bill. So I wouldn't use the word subsidize, but to your broader point, in terms of some of these allocations, overall within the district system, approximately 1/3 of revenue is from service charges, and approximately 2/3 is from commodity charges. However, for the typical single-family residential customer that uses 8 units per month, or 16 units on the bi-monthly, that ratio does end up being more around 43% on the fixed or service charge, and about 57% on the commodity charges. And again, that's about, that gets back to how fixed costs are recovered through the service charge.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just making an observation, based on this exemplary numbers, that the average household is paying more than the average cost of water, that the average cost to the district to provide that water. And I guess the follow-on is that this board has opined, or some members of the board have opined, to further increase the proportion of revenues that are derived from fixed charges. And if that were to happen, that would move the balance point. That is, the average household would be paying even more proportionally than the cost of the district to deliver that water. So I think, right now at the current division of fixed charges to variable consumption charges, we're already seeing that the average household is, I understand your objection to the term subsidize, but it is paying more than the average cost of to the district to deliver that water.
Mr.
That's my comment.
Nishimura,
Thanks.
this is Robert Shaver. I would suggest that this kind of conversation is more appropriate for the August workshop when we're discussing rates. That's when the board makes decisions on how the costs that the district, is dealing with get spread among the customer base. There are countless factors that can be considered in how the board designs its rates. It could be how far is a particular customer away from a treatment facility? What size diameter pipe serves a customer? There's a whole bunch of factors. So, what the board does is come up with a rate structure that is optimum for all of the situations that the district is dealing with. And they will have a detailed discussion on that topic, I am sure, in August.
Okay.
So, thank you.
Understood. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nishimura. Are there any other questions or comments, either from members of the public or members of the board? Hearing none, I think that concludes this item. Is that correct, Mr. Wunderlich?
Yep, that concludes the item.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, we will move on to item 4.2, review of the draft fiscal year 2021-2022 and fiscal year 2022-2023 budget. And for the sake of time, I will refrain from reading the full blurb in the agenda.
President Akbari,
Yes.
I wrote
Sethi.
a memo to you and the general manager, Mr. Stevenson, Mr. Wunderlich, earlier today, and I expressed the opinion that I thought this presentation should be split into two separate meetings, especially since I have to leave for another responsible meeting that I have for the water district at about 5:45. I went through the entire presentation. It's very lengthy. There's a lot to discuss, and I'm just expressing the opinion that I really think this ought to be split in half. I don't know where the dividing point is, but we're already, more than half an hour into the meeting. So I just want to throw that thought out to the other board members.
Would any board members object to us splitting this into two separate meetings? We have another placeholder, I believe, a week from today.
I don't, Jim Gunther.
I don't have any objections, but I would like to see how much we could get through before Director Sethi needs to leave, and perhaps make the decision to split the meeting and find a cutoff point, if necessary, perhaps 10-20 minutes before Director Sethi has to leave. Would that work?
Yeah. Why don't we see where we're at in about an hour? And for the sake of time, I'll ask staff to skip over any slides that they feel are can be skipped over and are still just included in the board packet, more for public information.
With that, then I'll ask Ms. Marcoux to advance us to slide 23 of the budget presentation, which I think will take her to about page 47 on her document.
And while Ms. Marcoux does that, as several board members have alluded to, there is another special board meeting tentatively scheduled on May 27th. Should the board request to receive additional information, analysis, or we're not able to adequately cover the material this evening. So ultimately, though, however, it's envisioned that staff will request the board to approve the budget and the capital improvement program at the June 10th regular board meeting. So with that, I will turn it back over to Mr. Wunderlich.
All right, thank you, Mr. Shaver. The 20 or so slides we've skipped over just provide some general district overview, as well as an overview of some accomplishments and goals that each department has set out. And anybody who is interested in looking at that may do so. It's all available on the district website. But what I wanted to take a moment and do first is recognize that we have significantly upgraded our budget document this year. And in particular, would like to recognize the work of Mr. Alm, Mr. Coran, and Mr. Birch in our finance department, who have taken the lead on writing the updated budget document, along with support from, of course, managers and supervisors throughout the district who have supported them. Obviously, each individual division manager wrote up their own overview and such that's in the department information section of the budget document. And so,
Mr. Wunderlich, if I
yeah.
may just add a short comment. I think that's one of the finest budget documents at the end of our presentation here that I have ever seen. As you know, I like to go through the other CAFRs and budget reports of other water districts, but this was an exemplary piece of work from all of our staff, and I hope it's represented when you try to go for your awards on, your budget and financial documents. Tremendous, absolutely exemplary work. That's all I want to say.
Great. Well, we definitely appreciate hearing that. And I know we did follow very closely the guidelines set out by the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States, and following their best practices in developing this document. So we're hopeful it will be well received by them as well. And so I'd also like to recognize at this point, as we're leading into this, Ms. Ipagunta, who's here with us, and of course, who manages the capital improvement program budgeting process and is an integral part of our budget development team. And so the former budget document, was basically a bunch of tables with numbers that said how much money we plan to spend, and it met the basic needs of what we needed to put a budget together. But the new budget document includes an overview of the district and its history and its functions. It provides a financial overview that includes a lot of narrative that explains our funding sources and how the funds are used, our budgeting policies and general financial policies. Of course, in the financial summaries, you'll find a lot of the tables and charts you're accustomed to seeing, many of which are actually kind of copied and pasted into this presentation to help facilitate our budget discussion this afternoon. And then we have a new section on the capital improvement program that summarizes the approach taken to planning for the CIP and the proposed capital budget. Much more detailed personnel overviews with staffing levels by department and division. And then, of course, the department information section, which provides a description of what each work unit in the district does, along with their own accomplishments, goals, and performance measures. And that'll become a regular part of the budget each year to report on how we're doing in achieving those performance measures. And then, just concludes with some supplementary information as well as a glossary. One thing that is not included in the draft budget that will be in the final version is a transmittal letter. So that is a standard component to include with any financial document. However, it was kind of premature at this stage as we need to make sure we understand what the final direction is from the board as will be received today and potentially next week before we can write that letter. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Aum to speak to us about the budget process and assumptions.
Thank you, Mr. Wunderlich. Thank you for the recognition. Good evening, President Akbari, members of the board. I'm Sidney Alm, Supervising Financial Analyst. So for this part of the presentation, I will review the biannual budget process, as well as key assumptions that are included in the proposed budget. For the water consumption on the slide here, the proposed budget does not assume additional conservation measures on top of the current program. The projected bill demands have been a little higher than anticipated for this year, and that is the forecast for the next 2 years. This is consistent with the proposed water supply expenditures. The financial planning model assumes a flat projected bill demands at 35.2 million gallons per day in the long term. The proposed budget includes investments to enhance water system reliability. The capital improvement program budget includes planned expenditures for the advanced metering infrastructure program, the Alameda Creek Fish Passage project, various main renewal program projects, and the reservoir and pump station improvement projects. To enhance water supply reliability, the budget does include costs for the Delta Conveyance Project, Los Vaqueros Reservoir Expansion Project, Water Reuse Project, and the Watershed Preservation and Protection. Through board actions in past years and in the current year, the district has reduced long-term costs by responsibly funding pension and other post-employment benefits liabilities, including advanced funding that will allow the district to fully fund its unfunded liabilities by June 2032, just about 11 years from now. The budget includes $31 million in total contributions towards pension and $8 million towards OPEB, other post-employment benefits over the next 2 years. Of those amounts, about 11 million of that is advanced funding for pension, and $3 million is advanced funding for OPEB. The budget includes funding to continue the existing defined term position. Currently, the district has 4 meter reader positions, that's defined term in the finance department, 1 engineering technician position, and 1 construction inspector position. So the budget does include continued funding for those defined term position. The proposed budget includes adding 4 new positions and reclassifying 1 position to support the district's core activities. 2 engineer positions being requested to be added in the project engineering division to support the district's capital improvement program implementation. 1 customer account representative to support the advanced metering infrastructure program. This position would be a defined term position. 1 position in operations and maintenance department, and reclassifying an engineer position in development services to construction inspector to meet district needs. To maintain district's financial capacity, the budget assumes a 3% water rate increase effective March 1st, 2022, and in future years. So these assumptions are built into the financial planning model, as well as the budget for the next 2 fiscal years. There is no rate increase for the current fiscal year. San Francisco Public Utility Commission proposed no changes to their wholesale water rate for fiscal year 2021. That's the fiscal year coming up. However, it's anticipated that their rates will go up by 7.1% in fiscal year 22-23, and a combination of 27.3% over the following 4 years. That's the planning horizon year that we looked at.
This is Director Sethi. I have 2 questions, please.
Yes, sure.
So, Mr. Ohm, on the engineering side, and to Mr. Stevenson too, are we factoring in farming out engineering work to outside engineering consulting firms where we could offload some of the work from the district? that's not in our, directly in our CIP, and I'm wondering about what our assumptions are for that, and how many millions of dollars, of the outlay might be for that. That's question number one.
Yeah, and I can quickly address that. We do a fair amount of that now, Director Sethi, letting contracts to engineering firms to do a good amount of the legwork related to capital projects, generally when they're highly technical in nature, or when there's a lot of time that needs to be spent that we can better utilize our existing staff in doing. And we expect to continue to do that. And as discussed during the main renewal program workshop, we're expecting to make some changes in that program to further, I guess I'd say, leverage the capabilities of other resources like consulting engineers and design build contractors to handle a fair amount of that work. So those are part of the plan going forward.
Okay, well, speaking specifically about main renewal, I keep insisting that we contract out to outside engineering firms a lot of that work. And I will just leave it at that. I want to limit the number of new hires that we have to make, where our investment per engineer is, maybe $1 million per engineering hire, and contract out as much as we can. So my second question is on the San Francisco PUC forecasted rate increases of 27%. Have we factored that into our future rate increases? That's a question of Mr. Wunderlich.
And the answer to that is yes. We receive usually 10-year projections from San Francisco on their future rate increases. That's all factored into our financial planning model. That's all factored into the financial planning model metrics that will be presented this evening.
And based on that 27% rate increase over that very few year period, what is the impact to our ratepayers on top of what the rate increases that we were already forecasting? What's the contribution to the rate increases that we can assign to SFPUC?
Yeah, so we currently spend, just doing some very quick back of the envelope types of things, we currently spend about $20 million a year on San Francisco purchases. So assuming our purchase amounts stay roughly the same, 27.3% increase adds up to, about $5 million a year in additional cost to the district. And so you would be looking at, over the course of, that's 4 fiscal years that's presented there. And we're projecting doing a 3% rate increase in each of those years. Well, one of that 3 would be to pay for San Francisco.
I'm sorry, but San Francisco is only 20% of our water supply, and the water supply is only 20% of the total cost. So I would think that it's really a much smaller fraction.
No, we spend about $20 million per year on San Francisco, but we'll get into more specific. Of course, I'm kind of rounding here. Mr. Alm will present specific costs as he gets through the presentation.
All right, thank you very much for the information. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Director. So I will continue if there's no other questions. The last bullet on this slide, labor and benefits costs are based on ongoing labor negotiation. Staff wanted to provide an update on the defined contribution retiree health plan. Currently, there are 59 total enrollments. 15 employees had opted into the plan. There were a few changes that did not make it into the proposed budget presented to you this evening. It didn't get into the budget in time, but staff plans to include these in the final proposed budget for board approval in June. The district anticipates receiving another $1 million grant from Oliver de Silva for the fish passage projects this year. The district already received $1 million from them last year. So combined would be $2 million. Staff is proposing to add changes to the conservation program for dry year operations that include 2 temporary staffing at a cost of $150,000, $50,000 for the Water Savings Assistant Partnership Program, $105,000 for Water Efficient Landscape Rebate Program. And staff also plans to include any potential changes in chemical cost budget.
And Mr. Ohm, if I could just add too, just to make sure the board and staff are aware that your incoming general manager is continuing to evaluate his thinking for the future and the needs of the agency going forward. And so as that process evolves, there may be some additional changes that are proposed above and beyond those shown on the last slide. So that's a process that's still underway.
Okay, so this next slide, this graphic illustrates the district's overall financial planning process. As part of the process, the district utilizes 3 main comprehensive long-range integrated planning models. Those include the Integrated Resources Plan, the IRP, the Capital Improvement Program, and the Financial Planning Model. These plans help guide the district's rate-setting process. The biannual budget process that's been covered tonight is part of the overall financial planning process. And it's important to note that public input plays a very important role in the process. So now we like to switch gear and jump into the budget in more details. I'd like to start with this slide, just an introduction of the status of the general fund. The table in the next slide will show a summary of the financial results and the budgets for the general fund. The district started the fiscal year 2021, that's the current fiscal year, with $6 million higher beginning balance compared to the amended budget, and projected to end the fiscal year, the current fiscal year, with an ending balance 1.2 million lower compared to the amended budget. That ends my part of the presentation, and if there is no question, I will now turn it over to Martin Coran, our senior financial analyst, who will speak on the last slide, on this slide, in more details. And Mr. Coran will also provide an overview of the next 2-year budget.
If I could make a quick comment on budgeting. I think it would be helpful if you prepared us a document on showing the marginal cost and marginal income of the district in total. It wasn't that long ago that our budget missed by 40% because our marginal cost or marginal income are so far out of sync. And that makes it we've been very fortunate the last several years that things have been remarkably static. But when there's a change in consumption, often through conservation, our budget is thrown totally out of whack. And we look now at staged rates and other things to try and get emergency income to us. But the fundamental problem, I believe, and I've argued in the past, is that our marginal income and marginal cost have not been brought into sync. So I'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Reed. Thank you, Mr. Ohm, for the introduction. Just to move on, so this slide shows the detail what we just discussed on the previous slide. I just want to highlight a few key points of financial performance for the general fund. This fiscal year, total expenses are projected at approximately $13.7 million below budget. That's $1.4 million in operational savings and $12.3 million based on the timing of capital projects, as well as our original budget for this year included $900,000 related to AMI-related debt service timing, which is being delayed until next year and the year after. Total revenues are projected to be $6.4 million below budget. Water sales revenues are slightly lower than budget. This is mostly due to the board-approved rate holiday in March.
Hey,
but also,
Mr. Karan, do we have the right slide up right now? I'm not identifying the numbers that you are.
yeah, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just explaining the general fund balances, the variances between the years. If you see the change in fund balance.
Yeah, well, where is the 13% that you're referring to?
The $13 million total expense. So this is, excuse me. So this is comparing the amended budget and the estimated budget in terms of expenses. So if you can see the estimated actual for this year, fiscal year 21 there in the middle column. Thank you for providing that icon there. We're projected $150.4 million. The actual amended budget for this year, the expenses were $164 million. So I'm comparing
I don't see these numbers on the slide that you're presenting here.
Really? Do you see?
We are seeing slide 34, I believe, on our screens.
That's correct. So if you look at the expenses row, so the top row is the general fund beginning balance, and then below that line there's a revenues line, a row, and then an expenses row. So those numbers are on the expenses row.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I forgot to provide an introduction to the format here of the budget presentation.
I see it now. I get it. I apologize.
No problem. And I'm sorry. I also apologize. I forgot to actually include the kind of basic introduction to the formatting here. So what you'll notice on all the budget slides, and they're all the same, is we provide basically like 5 years of budget data. There's last year's fiscal year 1920 actual activity. So general fund balances, revenues and expenses, ending balances. Then we compare the amended budget for this current fiscal year, 2021. We compare that with the estimated actual for this year, which obviously things change throughout the year depending on various priorities and various issues that come up. And then we have 2 proposed budget years, fiscal year 21-22, which is next year, and the following year, fiscal year 22-23. Okay. So now I'm going to talk about revenues, and I'm discussing right now really the amended budget, estimated actual, just the differences. So total revenues are projected to be $6.4 million below budget. Actually, I already said that. So water revenues are slightly lower than budget due to the approved rate holiday in March. There are also grant reimbursements are projected below budget due to timing of capital projects, but these will still be reimbursed as the projects reach their milestones in the next couple of years. So big picture, the general fund balance is projected to decrease $2.4 million compared to last year. So now I'm looking estimated actual 2021 in the middle column versus the 1920 actual. So 123.8 versus 121.4. Okay, so we're going down slightly, $2.4 million to 121.4. But then next year, we're projected to add $5.9 million to the ending balance. And the year after that, in fiscal year 22-23, projected to add $4.8 million. Both of these are due to timing of the AMI project costs and related debt proceeds. But we'll get into more detail on the following slides.
Mr. Karan,
Yes, sir.
others, I have a comment here. We're going from expenses of 125 million up to 164. A lot of that is based on the CIP expenditures that we plan to make.
Yes.
And we've always missed our forecast in the past few years. So I actually find this number of 164 million to be very questionable as to whether on an amended budget we can actually meet that target for this fiscal year that we are already in. So I would ask Mr. Stevenson, give us some confidence factor that we actually are going to spend this amount of money.
Director Sethi, if I may just preempt Mr. Stevenson very quickly. So the estimated actual is the middle column for this fiscal year. That's where we think we're going to end up this year. So if you look at the expenses, $150.4 million, this fiscal year estimated actual is less than the amended budget that we thought we would be spending at this time last year, this current fiscal year. And the big difference in that is the capital project, the CIP, was very, very aggressive at the time. And it's been toned down a bit to make it more manageable, right? And so the numbers that you see in the estimated actual column, in that middle column, those reflect more of reality, what we're expecting to happen this fiscal year.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. You did a great job filling in for me. Yeah. And you can see also in those fiscal year 21, 22, 22, 23 columns, the CIP remains aggressive, but what we've spent a lot of time on with this budget process is trying to ensure it's as realistic as we can make it, given what we know right now. We did have some projects that were slated for construction, say, for example, beginning this summer, that are now being pushed off as a result of some permitting issues and so forth. And we always have to make adjustments based upon actual project development timelines. But I think you'll see in the portion of the presentation that Ms. Ipagunta presents that we've tried to smooth out those dollars and get them as realistic as we can make them. I think even this year with the CIP completion rate that we've been able to achieve, it's significantly better than in the past on a percentage basis, and we've been doing an awful lot of work, but we're trying to further improve that going forward.
Well, I'm glad to see that we're being more realistic here.
Next slide, please. So this next slide up here, I'll go through it very quickly. It basically just shows the economic impacts of COVID-19, how they impacted unemployment, CPI, and gross domestic product. So basically, as you can see on the, there are some big negative red numbers on this chart. After last year's shutdowns dragged the economy has mostly rebounded since then. So if you can see, just for instance, June 2020, GDP quarterly data, negative 32.9%. By the following quarter, September 2020, positive 33.4%. So just as there'll be an illustration of this on the next slide, but basically things are getting, the economy is improving, things are improving. Yes, there are still issues. However, overall, general indicators are economic performance is improving. One other number, though, that I want to point out here on this chart is the past due balances for water revenue. You'll notice past due balances have increased 250% since last year. So March 2020, we were at $500,000 past due. Now, March 2021, we're at $1.3 million past due. So the average past due balance over the past 12 months is $1.2 million. So this is a challenge that we're facing moving forward.
I will point out that in last week's Aqua presentations, we had one presentation from Eastern Municipal Water District, which I believe is about twice the size of us revenue-wise, approximately. And they had close to 30% of their accounts overdue past 61 days. I believe Director Weed and Director Gunther also saw that presentation. So, and we heard from other water districts as well that had past due balances way up into the double teens, past 61 days due. So we're actually doing better than most water districts in the state of California from what we learned.
Mr. John Weed, just another quick note. While we're done exceptionally well compared to other districts. But one of the things that also came out of the last ACWA conference was a presentation talking about the ability to take past due accounts, both the commodity and service charge, since it's a fixed number, and bill it on a property tax bill, which becomes a lien on the property. So it's one of the options that's available to us, should we be able to get the support of a 2/3 majority of the board and the cooperation of the county of Alameda and the tax collector, that there's yet another way to recover some of these costs. They may not be totally lost. And they may not have to be, we may not have to be in the collection business.
I will comment as well. I did also watch that presentation, and I learned some stuff. I'll just leave it at that for now. It's for the, that would be for racing charges.
Yeah, so just to clarify too, as staff, we do not consider this lost revenue. This is past due balances owed on active accounts. So we would expect, as long as the account is active, we still have an opportunity to collect these funds. There's no write-off related to this in the budget. But I would expect that as the appropriate time comes, which again is not this evening, to start talking about reinstating collections activities, that would be an appropriate time to also talk about whether the property tax roll is an appropriate venue and how that relates to some of these issues. But I just did want to clarify that for now and in the budget, these funds are assumed to be collectible.
Okay, thank you. If we can move to the next slide, please. So this is just a GDP graph since the first quarter 2016 until, projected through the fourth quarter of 2023. And you can see the second quarter of 2020 was, the shutdown and the big drop off of a cliff. But it's been mostly a V, shaped recovery. And the trend, it appears to be our friend at this point in time. So things are looking up. I mean, we can just, from here, I think, first quarter GDP surged 6.4%. So economy is looking good. We move on to the next slide. So water consumption. This chart really illustrates consumption by fiscal year by month for this current fiscal year, the two prior fiscal years, as well as for comparison purposes, the lowest drought year, 2015, 2016. So as you can see, fiscal year 2021, which is the green line, is following a similar cyclical trend as the prior years, with higher consumption in the summer, lower consumption in the winter. Overall, year-to-date consumption is up 5% as of April compared to the prior year-to-date. And I don't know if you can tell the colors there, but the purple line is 15-16, the drought year. And then the black line is last fiscal year. So overall, the green line this year, we're doing well. Next slide, please. This next slide illustrates consumption by fiscal year by month for the same time frame. The solid lines show residential consumption, while the dashed lines down below show commercial consumption. Residential consumption makes up 71% of the total. So as you can see, the green line, overall year-to-date residential consumption is actually 8% higher than last year. Commercial makes up 23% of total consumption. And although April is higher, as you can see, fiscal year 2021, the green dashed line down below is trending lower than prior years. And in fact, overall year-to-date commercial consumption is down 3% compared to last year. Just a little extra detail to provide some more context. So if we exclude landscape, commercial is down 5% compared to last year. As you may remember, a dry and warm spring last year resulted in landscape irrigation, making up for the reduction in indoor commercial water consumption at the beginning of COVID-19. So this trend is likely to continue, but in fact, commercial landscape consumption is up 5% year to date compared to last year. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're moving into the budget overview. So all of the finance slides have the same format, showing 1 year prior activity, the amended budget for this year, along with estimated actuals, and the 21-22 and 22-23 proposed budgets. We also show percentage changes between the fiscal year 21-22 proposed budget and the current year estimated actual, as well as the change between the proposed budgets 21-22 and fiscal year 22-23. I'm going to take a little more time on this one. So water revenue. Forecast demands have been a little higher than anticipated for this year, and that is forecast for next year as well, to reflect overall consumption increases. Future years' consumption has been budgeted conservatively at about 35.1 MGD, with 3% rate increases in fiscal year 21-22 and thereafter. I want to draw your attention also to grants. So grants we discuss in further detail in the upcoming slides, but overall, thanks to the hard work of district staff, the district was awarded an additional $2 million from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation for the AMI project. That number is not reflected in these budget numbers. It actually comes in, we're expecting it in fiscal year 23-24, but I wanted to mention that the hard work of the district grants team. Let's see. Total revenues. So overall revenues, the current year are expected to come in 1% below budget. This is mostly due to two things. So declining customer jobs revenues as development flattens out and delays in expected grant reimbursements due to CIP project timing. And the remaining portion of it is related to the March 2021 board approved rate holiday. So for the proposed budget years, 21-22 and 22-23, total revenues are expecting to stay relatively flat, around $154 million, as water revenues and property taxes trend upward. So grants revenues do tail off as we expect to complete major grant funded and reimbursed projects over the budget period. Next slide. So this next slide details the three major components of water revenues that we summarized on the previous slide. So the consumption charge makes up approximately 66% of total water revenues, and this is based on each unit of water used. The service charge is 33% of total water revenues, and this is the fixed charge based on the customer meter size. The remaining amounts include fire line service, backflow testing, account establishment charges, etc. And this chart is really just a graphic version of the previous table that illustrates overall expected revenue changes over the budget period based on the most recent assumptions we already discussed. So a combination of rate changes approved by the board in past years, along with development activity and expected grants.
I have a question for staff here. So about 1/3 of our water revenue comes in from the fixed charge, but it was also mentioned that we're close to 43% on fixed revenue coming into the district. Can you clarify that for us here?
Yeah, so I'm the one that said the 43% number, so let me clarify that. For a typical customer, so kind of the median single-family residential customer, their bill is approximately 43% service charge and 57% commodity charge. However, there are a lot of customers, if you think of this like a distribution, right, where 8 is the median per month, you have customers on the tail end that use a significant amount of water. And so once you factor that in, as well as the water use of commercial customers, on a district-wide basis, it averages out to approximately 1/3 service charges and 2/3 commodity charges.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wunderlich.
Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, next slide, please. So grants and reimbursements. Staff has worked very hard to secure an additional $4.5 million in grants, bringing the 4-year total to $34.2 million. This includes an additional $1 million from Oliver De Silva, which is still not yet in the budget document that you have in front of you, but it is on following summary slide. There's the additional $2 million from the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, for AMI, which is currently budgeted in fiscal year 23-24. So the grants management team, they meet monthly to discuss and identify future opportunities to pursue from a variety of sources. And they are constantly looking out for new grants. Next slide, please. For example.
What is the Prop 1 money coming from? Well, what does that relate to, the Prop 1? We had a $100 million proposal at one time for Prop 1 funding.
Yeah, Prop 1, let's hold on, I have details. Actually, there's more details on the following slides.
Okay, so when you have an opportunity to identify that, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Let's go back to. Okay, so staff recently submitted applications for funding through FEMA for the Alvarado Niles Pipeline Project through both the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program and the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities programs, and for the Alameda and Dakota Reservoir projects through the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. The grants team is also submitting an application for Patterson Reservoir project through the same program. Then we have the detailed breakdown is on the next slide. So Prop 1, oh goodness, I thought it was on there. I apologize, I actually thought that the Prop 1 monies were identified on there as Prop 1. I will have to get you the details. Please bear with me. I thought it was on there.
Mr. Foran, isn't it next to conservation? Is that the Prop 1 Regional Conservation Grant?
Yeah, there's one of them. One of them is there. So the conservation one that you see there for $312,000 over the time frame.
RD3 is
RD3 is the next one. Yeah.
Yeah. So sorry, I'm jumping in here. So the previous slide identified 3.3 million in Prop 1. It's not specifically mentioned, so I'm wondering if any of this like IRWIMP grant money may be coming through Prop 1. But
yeah,
I can chime in. Yeah, the IRWIMP grant funding does come through Prop 1, and we may have some of the Sigma funding coming through Prop 1. I'll have to double check on that too.
Yeah, I believe that's a total of Prop 1 dollars. There are several grant programs that we've participated in that were through Prop 1, including the CDFW Watershed Restoration Grant. So I think that's a total that's listed there.
Yes. Yes, it is a total. Oh, Coastal Conservancy for RD3 is also on there. I'm sorry, I thought the other ones were listed. Okay, we can get you some more details. Okay. Next slide, please. So overall, total expenses across all funds are estimated to be $15 million below the budget for this fiscal year. So again, this is comparing amended budget for 21 versus the estimated actual for fiscal year 21. And this is mostly as a result of shifted capital project schedules that we've already discussed. But then if you look at the proposed budget years for fiscal years 21, 22, and 22, 23, expenses stay relatively flat. So if you look at the bottom right corner and you look at the percentage changes between the fiscal years, 1% change between estimated actual and the proposed budget for 21, 22, and then it's flat, 0% between 22, 23 and 21, 22. So getting to O&M costs. So source of supply costs are budgeted. Budgeted demands have been a little higher than anticipated for this year, and that is forecast for next year as well. Large swings in this category are driven by the cost of purchased water, which we will detail in a few slides. Customer accounts, you will notice an increase of about $2 million this year. This is because we now charge overhead to customer accounts. Therefore, you will notice a corresponding decline in the administrative and general category as a result. I also want to take this time just to kind of update the board on the electronic billing, EBPP. Very successful and popular with customers. There are over 59,000 customers signed up, so that's 69% of our customer base, and 82% payment volume is coming in, including one-time payments. So it's a very successful program so far. Moving on to administrative and general costs. These reflect a combination of factors. So fiscal year 2021 estimated actual is expected to come in lower than budget, mostly due to, as I mentioned, additional overhead charges to customer accounts, which results in larger expense credits to administrative and general. There's actual vacancy savings, and there are also savings in pension and OPEB contributions as a result of the updated actuarial valuations. So these costs, the costs that's shown here above for A&G now include OPEB advanced funding. The costs are detailed separately on an upcoming A&G slide. So regarding OPEB and pension advance funding, still on the same schedule, 15 years at 6.5% with the level dollar and ending June 30th, 2032. Expense projects, the other major category. The major project here is the Los Vaqueros expansion, which adds $6.5 million over the next 2 years. Other projects proposed over the next 2 years include integrated resources planning for about $490,000, as well as $451,000 for PFAS treatment studies and $800,000 for water quality expenses. There will be a little bit more detail on those items a little later. And then CIP, obviously. The aggressive capital program continues over the next few years. It's a bit more realistic than it was, that we thought it would be last year. But this will be described in greater detail by our project engineering manager, Ms. Pagunta, in the CIP section.
Mr. Coran, I would like to make a comment here, really in the public interest, that the $6.5 million assigned to the Los Vaqueros expansion is not a commitment of our board right now. This is we are outlooking something. We have not made a commitment, a final commitment to the project and the expenditure of these dollars.
Okay.
I think that needs to be made very clear to our public.
That's totally correct, Director Sethi. Our budget is a plan, and as everybody knows, sometimes plans change. And in this case, the board has made it very explicit that they're expecting a comprehensive business case presentation, and staff is committed to provide just that when we can.
And could I quickly ask, is that $6.5 million for what time frame? Not just 2 years. This would be for a number of years, would it not?
Well, in this case specifically, it's the next 2 years, so 21, 22, and 22, 23. That's just what's in the proposed budget years. And indeed, thank you for the clarification. It is a plan.
Well, beyond a plan, it would be if we got involved, it would be a long-term commitment at about this investment rate, would it not?
Yes, exactly.
Thank you.
But that, further details on that will be described in the capital improvement section. Next slide, please. So this is just the graphic version of the previous table that illustrates overall expected total operating expense changes based on the most recent assumptions we discussed. As you can see, next fiscal year, 1% increase in comparison to the estimated actual. And then the following fiscal year, 22-23, is flat 0%. In the numbers on these charts, it looks like everything's remaining pretty flat. So just an easy picture to understand what our total operating expenses look like over the budget period. Next slide, please. So above are the actual and estimated cash balances for all funds for the beginning and ending of each fiscal year. Since fiscal year 1920 ended better than originally estimated, fiscal year 2021, the current year, started off on better footing. So taking into the account the revenues and expenses we already discussed, we expect to finish this fiscal year 2021 $3.5 million better than the amended budget projected at this time last year. So The ending balance next year, 21-22, is projected to be about $3 million above this year, mainly due to debt proceeds related to AMI and starting next year, 21-22. This next slide, it's titled Debt Reserves and Debt Indicators, but really we should take out the debt part. It's reserves and debt indicators. The main takeaway here is reserves meet or exceed the established targets. Let's just bring your attention, let's look at 1920 for the general fund. The target, if you can see on that second column, the target was 62.5 million. The actual was 123.8. And that trend continues across all of the fiscal years, amended budget, estimated actuals, and proposed budgets as well. And then you can see our debt service coverage ratios, as was previously discussed in the presentation. Our debt coverage ratios are very healthy. Next slide, please. Now we're going to get into a bit more detail on the operations and maintenance expenses. So these costs are highly dependent on water purchases, power, and chemicals, and these can fluctuate widely from year to year. We'll get into a bit more details on these things in later slides, but please notice that fiscal year 2021 estimated actual is higher than the trend due to higher demands. It's a dry year, plus COVID, plus a lot of people working from home. There's also increased purchases from San Francisco PUC, and this was due to a combination of production constraints related to PFAS concerns at Blender, and also reduced rates at Water Treatment Plant 2 due to water quality concerns. Next slide, please. So this chart illustrates what we just discussed. It just makes it easier to see the expense trends. So estimated actual for this year, slightly higher than the amended budget because of the cost increases due to higher demands. And then there's some projected savings next year and the year after. We get into administrative and general.
I have one question on that previous slide, which is not broken out, but maybe somebody can talk to the point. Where are our electricity costs going?
Electricity is part of the power budget, and we will actually also discuss that power, power for pumping. A lot of it goes towards pumping, and then treatment in other places.
So we're introducing a lot of solar to our district, and I'm really wondering how that's going to affect our electricity costs. As I have noted in the past, about 5% of our operational costs were related to electricity, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to reduce that part of our operational budget down by 1 or 2 or even 3%. So I'd like to have staff keep an eye on that and let us know whether we're improving on that part of our expenditures.
Absolutely. Thank you, Director Sethi. Okay, now here's some detail on administrative and general expenses. So these include district-wide benefits for all employees. So these expenses are expected to come in approximately 2% below budget this fiscal year, and then increase by 5% next year and 2% the following year, 22-23. So there are savings in pension and medical premiums this year, mainly as a result of actual staffing being below budgeted full staffing. And there's also additional OPEB pension savings due to board decisions to aggressively fund the liabilities related to them, and the related updated actuarial results too. So increases in the proposed budget years are based on full staffing and medical cost inflators identified in the actuarial reports. Next slide, please. So again, this slide just shows the picture of what we just discussed. This year's savings are easy to see in the middle column above, and then the next two columns for the next two fiscal years. they show budget at full staffing. Next slide. So these next two charts illustrate the percentage breakdown of total general fund labor costs by cost center, including capital projects, customer jobs, and debt service. So this is the total general fund budget. This chart shows total general fund proposed budget for fiscal year 21-22 of $154 million, of which labor is 34% of the total. So the chart here shows, kind of solid colors. I'm going to take source of supply in the blue sector of the pie, source of supply, other, and there's source of supply labor, which is the dark blue shaded. So each of the darker shaded colors reflect the labor portion of that particular cost center. So overall, as a percentage of the total budget, labor makes up 34%. And this is really because providing high quality water at a reasonable cost requires significant infrastructure expenses. A water utility is very heavy on infrastructure. And for comparison purposes, a city government is approximately 85% labor. So out of this, about $107 million is operating expense, $41 million is capital and customer jobs, and the remaining $5.5 million of this 154 is debt service. So fiscal year 22-23, same concept, just illustrating $153 million proposed budget for fiscal year 22-23, of which labor is 35% of the total. 110% of that is operating expense, 36 million is capital and customer jobs, and the remaining $6.5 million is debt service. And that includes debt service on the proposed AMI debt. Next slide, please. Now this slide illustrates labor expense by cost center by fiscal year. So as you'll notice, total labor expenses, they're relatively consistent across fiscal years. The estimated actual shows savings. Estimated actual for fiscal year 2021, that middle column, shows savings associated with vacancies. The proposed budget years are based on full staffing, and there's a modest 3% vacancy savings rate built in, because we always have some level of vacancy throughout the organization. So we're attempting to show that here. Next slide. Next up are employee benefits. The main takeaway here is that the annual pension and OPEB costs are decreasing as a result of the board's actions to aggressively fund the associated unfunded liabilities. This leads to improved actuarial performance and therefore lower annual costs. The main highlight here, you'll see OPEB and OPEB advanced funding lines are broken out separately, but the OPEB and pension advanced fundings, there's 11 years remaining, 6.5% level dollar ending June 30th, 2032. Next slide, please. So this slide shows authorized positions, vacancies, and retirements since fiscal year 2014-2015. So in that year, the district had 238 full-time equivalent positions, dropped to 230 over the next fiscal year, and is now at 236, 3 of which are defined term. The 4 new positions are being requested during this budget process, 1 of which is defined term. And then vacancies, you'll notice this year's vacancies are actually below average of the previous 5 years. The previous 5-year average is 15 vacancies a year. We're down to 3 so far we have 8 this year. All right, now we're getting some meat. So purchase water. Overall, the district is experiencing higher costs this year and next year due to the following reasons. There are higher production costs from higher demand due to dry year conditions, as well as COVID-19 and resulting work from home. Although these production costs are typically offset with corresponding higher revenue. In fiscal year 2021, due to a combination of production constraints related to PFAS concerns at Blender and reduced rates at Water Treatment Plant 2 due to water quality concerns, the higher demand can only be met by using San Francisco water above the minimum purchase. So production constraints related to PFAS limitations at Blender will continue for the next couple of years, and this will require additional San Francisco volumes above the minimum purchase.
I have a question. I have a question here, which is really directed at Mr. Nizar. I thought that we were going to be using more of our water bank in Kern County and averaging out a lower cost of water. So what is actually going on here right now?
While we wait for Mr. Nizar to reply.
Or maybe Laura Heides.
It's
Miss Heides.
Yeah, let's see. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm having some computer challenges.
I thought we were taking from in our last board meeting, we had a presentation on our water supply forecast for the year. And we were taking in a lot more water from Kern County from our water bank to lower our water costs. So it seems contradictory here to me, what's being presented right now.
Yeah, and I'll just double check if Mr. Nizar's, is it working? Yes, we can hear you. So I know he would appreciate the opportunity to speak to this. So go for it.
Sure. It's a combination of factors this year that is exacerbated by the increased demand that we're also seeing right now. So this gets to, frankly, going back to the water efficiency master plan where we discussed the avoided cost of water or production is actually that coming from our blender facility. That's what we're seeing this year. So we have the PFAS blending additional concern. We have a water treatment issue at TP2, as Mr. Karan mentioned earlier, but we are seeing higher demand because of the dry conditions. And those are contributing to a marginal increase in our SFPUC purchase, despite the fact that we're getting our full supply back. This is frankly a scenario where if we had more capacity at TP2 or if we had treatment plant number 1 online, we wouldn't be needing to purchase more San Francisco supply. But this is the reality that we're in currently.
Mr. Nizar, looking at this chart, I'm looking at the green portions of the bar chart and just wanted to confirm that we brought in additional semi-tropic water this year in anticipation of going into a dry spell. So you can see between the years fiscal year 2019-20 and 2021, our semi-tropic related expenses increases. And then obviously into this year, and we're assuming next year, and then it goes down again. So I think that's what we're seeing here. Is that correct?
We are taking full capacity back from semi-tropic. In fact, our current update is we're actually getting even more than the contractual obligation to provide 13.5 thousand acre feet. That is correct.
So these green, again, this is a plan, but if we can, these green pieces of the bars might be a little larger magnitude. It just goes to show that it's in the big scheme of things, semi-tropic is not a super expensive source of supply, and it's very important during these dry periods.
Yeah, and in fact, I believe we actually get more water back from semi-tropic in that little green bar than we get from San Francisco on the big blue bar.
That is correct, by several thousand acre feet.
Okay, well, this leads into another question, and I don't mean to go on a tangent, so give me the briefest answer that you can, which is we essentially mothballed TP1 a few years back. When is staff going to give us a presentation on what the future opportunities are for TP1?
Well, I mean, I can start because it was my recommendation to go ahead and mothball water treatment plant number 1 with a 10-year commitment. I think we're probably on that timeline. And the idea is once we start seeing our likely San Francisco purchases consistently staying above the minimum, then it's really time to begin looking at reactivating water treatment plant number 1 seriously. So that's kind of where we are. And it's getting closer to that time where we would consider that. And I would imagine that it also would make sense, in combination with with potential participation in the LVE project. So we would also like that information before coming back to the board with a comprehensive Mission San Jose water treatment plant presentation.
Well, 2 comments here, and I'm not expecting an answer right now, but just comments for consideration. One is that any reactivation of TP1 is going to be a very considerable expense for the district in terms of upgrading, new technology, everything that we have to do to make that plant reoperationable. And so that needs to be factored into our CIP forecast. Number 2, whether or not BOSCA participates in LVE, we need to take into consideration that there's going to have to be a pipeline into the Bay Area and processing of water. And right now there are only 2 treatment plants that could offer treatment of that water for the Bay Area. One is TP1 and one is the Berryessa plant in Santa Clara Valley Water District territory. So we need to take all these things into consideration. And when we're talking about, putting something in place operational within 5 years, that has to be factored into our CIP. At least what the estimate might be, just like we're estimating the costs on participating in LVE.
I don't disagree, Director Sethi. What I anticipate is that the staff will be embarking soon on an update of the integrated resources plan, and all of these issues will need to be incorporated into that. And then with the Mission San Jose water treatment plan specific decision, it's really going to be driven by business case predominantly. And that business case is going to be cost savings of San Francisco water, which will drive that project, in my opinion. However, I think staff has heard your remarks and will incorporate it into their thinking.
Yeah, well, one additional remark is that if BOSCA has, or even City of Hayward has to rely on our treatment plant number 1, that's revenue for our district for processing and distributing the water. Don't forget that.
Certainly. So with that, I know that there are time restrictions this evening. We have about maybe 4 more slides we can get through quickly, do a little Q&A, give members of the public an opportunity to speak, and then we'll probably have to pick up the CIP aspect of the presentation next week. Does that make sense, to President Akbari?
Yes, that works. Is that fine with the board?
Yes, President Akbari, I'm going to be leaving the meeting within 5 minutes to join the other board I serve on for the Water District, the Southern Alameda County GIS
Yes.
board meeting for this evening. It's starting at 6 o'clock at City Hall, so
Not a
I'm
problem.
gonna get going on that.
Yeah, not a problem. So we have about 4 more slides that we can get through. And then, like Mr. Shaver mentioned, we'll do a quick Q&A and then we'll conclude for tonight.
Thank you. Can we move to the next slide, please? We'll talk power. Ms. Marcoux, can you please forward one more slide, please, to power? Thank you. All right. So power budget, big picture here, power budget was very conservative this fiscal year for the amended budget. Power budget is based on two major factors. So water demands, which we already discussed, as well as PG&E rates. So pumping energy costs are very strongly tied to water demands. In turn, water demands are strongly influenced by the summer weather. So an early start to a dry, hot summer, which extends long into the fall, can easily increase typical monthly power costs by $50,000 or more. So hopefully a solar array will help alleviate some of these costs. The first,
Mr. Coran,
Yes.
I would ask that in the future, when you give the same presentation, that we show the contribution of our solar arrays toward our energy costs. The entire community here, all of our ratepayers are making an investment in our solar installations. And so it would be very nice to actually see what the contribution is, current and even forecasted, toward the reduction in our energy costs. That was the primary reason why we went to solar, was to get our the 5% of our operational costs down. That was the energy costs there. So I would just request that in the future we try to show our community what it's kind of the return on investment, idea. What return are we getting? How much are we being able to reduce our costs because of the solar contribution? Thank you.
Yeah, and I think as those projects are implemented and we begin receiving the solar power, then we'll absolutely factor that into future presentations.
Let me suggest it may well be worth a separate presentation, because I believe the results will be just the opposite of what Director Sethi has suggested, that the cost of the value net power for viewed as solar is nominal now because of the over solar of the state of California.
Well, I think what staff will do is provide data and the board can determine how it turned out.
Director Weed, I will place a really nice bet with you for a good steak dinner. I'll treat you out if I'm wrong.
okay.
But when you talk about power, you're also talking about natural gas. In future presentations, we can look at the cost of gas, which is 24/7, as opposed to solar, which is limited in its time frame.
Might as well chime in. We might not forget that we've also included a lot of cost efficiencies, and we also generate the power coming down the hill from 2. So the cost savings that we've generated through our other efficiencies might be a nice thing to add in there. I know it's more work, but still.
Okay. Moving on to chemicals. Chemicals, as you know, are required to treat raw water to drinking standards. Water quality has been challenging this winter and spring because of the dry year, so chemical use is higher than it was last year. Production has been slightly higher at treatment plant 2 this year in comparison to last year, following increased system demands that are attributed actually to the pandemic. So in fiscal year 2021, this year, some chemicals have experienced a sharp increase in pricing due to market conditions surrounding the pandemic. For example, liquid oxygen increased 55% and carbon dioxide by 66%. Treatment plant 2 production is higher this year to meet increased demands. So for next fiscal year 21-22, chemical increases are expected as a result of an increase in chemical pricing. For instance, hydrofluosilicic acid has increased 70% and aqueous ammonia has increased 56%. So, I mean, these are big cost increases. I just want to remind the public and the board, the district does participate in a regional consortium to ensure best possible pricing for chemicals. And staff works very hard to negotiate lower prices as much as possible. So that's it for chemicals. Debt service. This slide shows the district's debt service and outstanding debt, and it's based on official debt service schedules. So debt service is flat this year and next year. It increases by $1.1 million to a total of $6.5 million in fiscal year 22-23. This is as a result of including payments on the potential debt issuance for AMI. And just as a reminder, proposed debt for AMI is $19.5 million split over 2 budget years. You see there fiscal year 21-22 and 22-23, the proposed debt proceeds $9.75 million in each of those years. Okay, and then the final slide for the budget overview, really this just shows capital expenditure totals from year to year and their associated funding sources between the general fund, facilities improvement fund, facilities renewal fund, and also customer jobs. So these totals exclude extraordinary expense projects, which are designated as operating expenses, and we already discussed on earlier in the presentation. So as you can see, the capital program budget increases significantly from last year's actual fiscal 19-20 $32 million to $48 million this fiscal year and next fiscal year. So much more, it's higher than it was last year, but there's been a lot of projects going on. As you know, CIP projects and milestones can change depending on various factors, such as the weather. So staff is projecting significant progress on many projects this year as a result. And with that, normally our project engineering manager, Ms. Pagunta, would take over to discuss the CIP, but we'll delay that until next week. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, I appreciate you working within our time constraints tonight. I want to first ask Director Sethi if he has any questions or comments, because I know he has to drop off.
I think he stepped out.
He's gone.
Okay, didn't realize that. Let me open it up to the board then for questions and comments.
John Weed, I'll have a comment on one thing that was highlighted here, and I've not fully appreciated the difference in the value of groundwater resources in being in the valley. And I would note that Governor Newsom in his emergency proclamation highlighted pump back as one of his themes of being able to survive a future drought, which is semi-tropic, pumping back water out of the ground. But semi-tropic, in the view of the Valley Water District, which has 4 times the investment that we do, is extremely vulnerable. And they're concerned that it will not survive Sigma. And that determination may be made by this time, by March of next year, is the deadline for the state to make the determination. They're overdrafting, they continue to plan on overdrafting through the 2040, unless the state says no. So, and their Irvine Ranch bailed on semi-tropic and followed the pattern because of the overdrafting and purchased farmland in the valley, working with Rio Bravo, where they control the groundwater. And it's their determination, they can let the land go fallow because they own it. So I would encourage us to look at what's going on, what's Valley Water District is desperately looking for additional water supplies from the valley, which is groundwater based. There are a number of different programs out there, but ultimately what Irvine Ranch did, which is to find land to buy and then work with the local water district to pump it back into our system. So thank you.
Just a couple of quick clarifications. My understanding is Valley Water is committed to semi-tropic. They're looking for additional water supplies beyond semi-tropic. I know there may be a director that may have concerns or two, but we have been in contact with staff and that's their strategy. With Irvine Ranch, they never elected to go with semi-tropic and instead went their own way because of their unique geographic location and what was available to them.
Well,
so
actually, clarification, actually, Irvine Ranch made an investment and purchased land to annex to semi-tropic can semi-tropic reimburse them for that expenditure? So they had bought in and then they bailed.
That's not my understanding, Director Weed, but we
and-
can confirm.
Okay, please. And I have the briefing here back in front of me that was given to the Water Supply Exploratory Committee and the board at Valley Water District, and they raised serious concerns about Sigma.
There are concerns about Sigma as well as contamination, but like every other groundwater related agency, those are issues that need to be dealt with and have to be dealt with.
Right. And to mitigate that is that the contract requires semi-tropic to reimburse us if they can't provide the water, even by legislative edict. So we have a methodology which may result in litigation, but to be reimbursed financially, that doesn't provide you water if you need it. So those just throwing that out. I would hope that we could look to expand our groundwater presence in the valley. Thank you.
Well, it looks like Director Sethi has left the meeting, so I was going to hold off commenting, let him get a chance, but I don't see him on anymore. I just like to comment on that. I listened to the keynote from Secretary Crowfoot, and he seems to be very interested in groundwater recharge, which is basically what we're doing with semi-tropic. So I understand the concepts and the difficulties with Sigma. Sigma didn't exist when the program first started. However, I do believe the state is very well set on trying to keep semi-tropic and those types of programs active and not have problems with Sigma. We'll see how it goes. However, if we were to buy a farm somewhere out in the valley, I seriously wonder how we would deal with Sigma, because my guess is those farms are already covered by Sigma districts. So unless we're going to get somebody who's already got a Sigma out there and get stuff from them, we're not going to get that. So, and I'm also assuming that Metropolitan probably would have already done this because they're really, really good at finding water. And I wouldn't be surprised they've already got the water rights to Mars. But I mean, those guys are, well, I don't want to use the words, but Met is really, really good at it. So I understand if we could find a farm out in the valley that didn't have issues, sure. I don't think they exist.
Well, the issue is not is the ability to let the land go fallow. The challenge with semi-tropic is that the farmers are still farming it, and the water that was allocated to us was going to be overdraft, and that was in the initial concept, and that's what we're living with.
So if I may,
I don't think so.
If I may, Director, President Akbari. So semi-tropic is a very interesting discussion. And I think since we're talking about capital expenditure and the budget for 2021 and 2021, 22, and 21, 22 to 21, 23, what a mouthful. Let's bring this back. I think the fact is that we are contractually protected in terms of water quality and water quantity that we could bring back from semi-tropic. So as far as this presentation and the estimate is correct, so the discussion actually will not have an impact on what we are discussing today in terms of capital expenditure and the semi-tropic estimations. At least that's how I see it, at least for these budget periods that we're talking about. So I would suggest we bring it back to the presentation. We could have a good semi-tropic discussion some other time.
Okay, I do have a question. If Director Weed, if he's finished, I have another question regarding another factor.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, actually, I'd like to go back to the slide that had the dollars, and I think I'm seeing something here. I just wanted to confirm it. The one with the semi-tropic, the delta, the cost, I think, of the water supplies, San Francisco And I know semi-tropic was in there. I don't remember exactly what page that was. It's a couple back.
Yeah, I think you're referring to slide 59 of the
graph.
budget presentation.
Yes, that, yeah, this one right here, water purchases. Now, this is just dollars. This doesn't actually equate to dollars per gallon, correct? Or
Correct. Total dollars. Yep.
So I would be interested in, because San Francisco is so much higher, it might be interesting to point out what those additional costs of having to bring San Francisco to, if we were to change that number and take away like semi-tropic, what the impact would be and how the difference would be in the dollars, because this is the cost of semi-tropic, but that's not necessarily the same dollar cost as San Francisco. Am I correct? Do you see where I'm going with that?
Yeah, so like for each 1,000 acre feet that, that switch, say from semi-tropic to SFPUC, right? We would
Correct.
be spending an extra, for 1,000 acre feet, I think that would cost us about $2 million for San Francisco water. And then we would only save a pretty small amount off of the semi-tropic because I think this 3.1 million for this year reflects bringing back more than 10,000 acre feet.
Yeah, so that's reasonably significant number. If you were to take that green section and move and eliminate it and put it to San Francisco water, it would be significantly higher. Obviously, we could probably do some with pumping, but if we were to take that 3 million of semi-tropic and convert that quantity to San Francisco, what would that, do we know what that number would be? Quick back of the envelope number.
Yeah, actually, we wouldn't even be able to do that because we have limits on the maximum San Francisco we can buy in a year. I think we're limited at about 15,000 acre feet and total San Francisco. And so we couldn't even completely do that. But if we were to go up to our maximum San Francisco purchase, I believe we'd be talking about an extra $10 million.
I think that's pretty significant. It doesn't really show well on the slide because you're looking at, the green sliver looks small, but in reality, that green sliver compared to the blue is quite significant.
Yep.
And I think I wanted to comment with Director Sethi, saw that, and I think it makes, when I was looking at that, I agreed, it looks smaller. The impact is much larger than what it actually shows.
Yeah, and I think, for all fairness to our friends at San Francisco who supply great water to us, we should acknowledge that the semi-tropic water is not new water supply. We are only bringing back surplus state water that we have stored there in prior years. And we also have water treatment costs, right? It is not delivered to us as already potable water. So 3.1 million is what we spend to bring back previous water that we have stored there. So it's not a complete apples to apples comparison, just for full fairness to the folks at San Francisco.
Sure, but it's still pretty significant.
No, absolutely, it's still significant.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for those comments. Any other comments or questions from the board? Hearing none. I did have one question, and I think this is maybe more for our engineering team. Actually, this is going way back onto staffing. I did notice in the budget document that we do call out our continued requirement to update our cybersecurity policies, and we've had some discussions about that in the past. I was curious if we're intending on adding any positions specifically related to that, either a security engineer or CISO or something similar in the out years.
Yeah, thank you, President Akbari. And I was definitely being a little bit overly cryptic when I mentioned to the board and the public and staff that as incoming general manager, I'm working on some considering our future needs in out years, as well as sort of prioritizing some of the important things that we're working on. And as part of that, I'm looking at potential need for additional resources. And one of the things that that I'm considering making a recommendation about has to do with just that fact, and the need to integrate our cybersecurity efforts and perhaps just make sure that we have somebody dedicated to that work. So yeah, that's definitely a consideration.
Okay, great, thank you. I want to open it up to members of the public as well. Are there any members of the public who wish to ask a question or make a comment? Mr. Ken Nishimura.
Thanks. Actually, this is the perfect slide. So I'm trying to reconcile the SFPUC figures for FY 21-22 and FY 22-23 with the statements made on slide 30 of this presentation, where you stated that, or it was stated that the SFPUC wholesale water rate increases are delayed. So there is no increase in 21-22, but between 21-22 and 22-23, there is a 7.1% increase. Yet in this slide that you're showing here, the amount of funds allocated for SFPUC remain constant. So I'm assuming that since we're going back down from 20 to 21, this is assuming the minimum contractual purchase in 21-22 and 22-23. And I would expect to see 22-23 be 7.1% higher.
No, so 21-22 is still above the minimum contractual purchase requirement. And so I think what we have here is and I'll ask Mr. Coran to correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think what we have here is a very amazing coincidence where 22-23, when we finally get all the way back down to the minimum purchase, we kind of stay at the same cost because the rate increase kind of balances out the reduced consumption.
Okay, so you're actually going to buy exactly 7.1% fewer acre feet of water from SFPUC.
Approximately, that would be my estimate, although I'll ask Mr. Coran if he can check the details, or we may need to follow up to provide an exact answer.
Thank you.
But I do know that 21-22 is still above the minimum purchase.
So Mr. Wunderlich, I'm looking at the details right now, specifically for water costs. And yes, it is true. 22-23 will go up, the 7%. I'm going to need some time to get into the details in terms of the volume stuff. So we will have to get back to you, Mr. Nishimura.
Thank you.
But what Mr. Wunderlich said is most likely correct. I apologize. I can't actually confirm it right now in the data. I have to really dig into it for that. Sorry.
May I interject?
Please.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Not anymore. We can't hear you anymore.
Go ahead, Thomas.
Sorry, here we are. Okay. Devin Becker, who's online, actually has the answer for this question. And I'd like to say, John, I'm glad you ventured that guess, because that was exactly what went through my head.
So thank you, Mr. Neiser. Yeah, I'll just weigh in here really briefly. So I'm not sure this is a completely full answer, but I think my understanding is that in terms of quantity, we will still have the same PFAS considerations going forward, even into 22-23. and therefore will be slightly above the minimum purchase. The expectations are to be slightly above the minimum purchase then as well, although we are anticipating an average water supply year for calendar year 23.
And the dollar amounts just very coincidentally are coming out on par.
Right. So I think, Mr. Becker, your volume was pretty low, but just to maybe repeat for the benefit of the rest of the group, I believe what you're saying is that we are expecting normal water supplies to be available in 22-23 in that fiscal year. San Francisco purchases would still be a little above the minimum to address PFAS requirements at the blending facility. But I think for 21-22, it's still not a regular water year that's assumed. So there's still, beyond just the PFAS requirements, perhaps still some supplemental San Francisco purchases.
Yes, I agree with at least the first part of that statement. And based on this graph, it looks like we intend to make up that additional portion of that, slightly different water year in 21-22 with semi-tropic returns.
Great, thank you, everyone. Are there any other questions or comments from members of the public? Hearing none, we will conclude item 4.2 for tonight. And as a reminder, we'll pick back up. I think I mistakenly said a week from today earlier, but it's a week from tomorrow, next Thursday. And we will pick back up with the CIP portion of the presentation. With that, we'll move on to item 5, General Manager's Reports. Mr. Shaver.
No specific reports this evening.
Great. Item 6, Director's Comments and/or agenda item requests. Any members of the board? Hearing none, we can then adjourn tonight's meeting at 6:11 p.m. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to staff.
Thank
Thank you,
you. And
everyone.
Sorry to drag